Colorama, a Recorded Books Highbridge imprint presents Bloody Tuesday, the untold story of the struggle for civil rights in Tuscaloosa, by John M. Giggie. Read by Christopher Grove. Prologue. The Memory You Choose. This book began in a barber shop. Reverend Thomas William T.W. Linton, the then 77-year-old owner, was sharing memories from his 60-year career while cutting my hair on a summer afternoon. It had been 2 years since I began coming to his shop after reading about him in the Tuscaloosa News in 2009. Reverend Linton loved to reminisce while he worked. When he was unhurried, he would talk for up to an hour before stashing his clippers and swinging the black barber's cape off my shoulders. No one was waiting in line that day, so Reverend Linton had the time to focus on me and tell a story about an event that changed his life. He had told me snippets of it before, but I had never heard the whole version until that day. Viewed from the street, Howard and Linton Barbershop does not appear as a place of historical importance. It sits among a row of low-slung, decaying storefronts on a quiet block on Tuscaloosa's west side, where blacks have lived in de facto segregation for generations. Thick safety bars cover the windows and front door, and the front awning has buckled with age. It lies 3 blocks west of Greensboro Avenue, once the city's main commercial corridor. Closer to the shop are the 550-bed county jail built in 1995, the Gulf, Mobile, and Ohio switching yards, and Greenwood Cemetery, where the tombstones of Confederate veterans are still decorated with holly wreaths at the holidays. That afternoon, Reverend Linton described a summer morning in 1964, when police and Klansmen brutalized hundreds of black men, women, and children, some as young as 10 years old. It took place 5 blocks up the street from his shop, he said, at First African Baptist Church. Protesters had gathered to march downtown to protest the segregated courthouse. As they were assembling on the front steps, police began to attack his people with everything they had: billy clubs, cattle prods, the butt ends of revolvers, and sticks spiked with nails. Demonstrators fled back inside the church, but they were not safe inside. Soon firefighters smashed the stained-glass windows and flooded the sanctuary with water shot from a hose. Police fired canisters of tear gas through the broken windows. As blacks burst from the church, wet and choking, police beat and arrested as many as they could grab. Nearly 100 black people were brought to jail that morning. Many more sought medical care at Druid City Hospital and Reverend Linton's barbershop. I came in, and they were hollering and bleeding, bodies everywhere. I couldn't find a clean towel, he said. Reverend Linton phoned Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr., who assured him help was coming, and gave him the office number of U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. Reverend Linton contacted Kennedy, who promised to do what he could for the city. Later, Reverend Linton and other blacks in Tuscaloosa would come to call June 9, 1964, Bloody Tuesday. Reverend Linton spoke in a voice rich and full of power. His tone was urgent, as if he were addressing a member of his church. Sometimes he fell silent and slipped into a deep fold of memory, hunting for the right words to describe the sound of a child's scream, or the name of the red-haired motorcycle officer who chased him that day. I sat still, watching him in the mirror. Reverend Linton said he had spoken publicly about this incident before, but not everyone, especially the young, believed him. That hurt him. What I remember most from that day, though, was how my haircut ended. As he was peeling off the neck strip, I half-heartedly mentioned that I might want to write a book about all of this. He leaned in and said in my ear, "You have to." I started to drop by Howard and Linton every 2 weeks or so, sometimes for a haircut, always for a story. Reverend Linton talked about what he thought people did not know, but needed to. My history, he called it. When our schedules allowed, we ate lunch next door at Maggie's, a tiny soul food restaurant run by his sister. He always ordered baked chicken, collards, a piece of cornbread, and something sweet. My visits became more regular. If I ever missed one, he would tell me at my following visit that he had waited for me. I learned that Reverend Linton was the eldest of 8 children raised in the farming community of Lewiston, about 40 miles west of Tuscaloosa. He was salutatorian of his 12-person graduating class at Eatman High School in 1951. He enrolled at Stillman College in Tuscaloosa, a historically black institution, because it was small, close, and sponsored by the Presbyterian Church. He secretly hoped attending a religious school would clarify a nagging sense of being called to the ministry. To support himself, he became an apprentice at Howard's, the busiest barber shop in the city, and honing the haircutting skills he had learned at home. In the fall of 1954, Reverend Linton left Stillman without completing his degree and began correspondence courses at Cumberland Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Bethel, Tennessee. He stayed in Tuscaloosa because the school forbade black students on campus. He soon became a co-owner of the barber shop, renaming it Howard and Linton. He married Annie Mae Morrow, and they started a family together. Phyllis was born in 1956, Felicia in 1959. After being ordained in 1958, Reverend Linton was named the assistant pastor at Thompson Chapel of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church of America, near Stillman College, and promoted to senior pastor after Reverend Louis S. Malisham retired. He resigned in 1977, he said, after the voice of the Holy Spirit instructed him to start a new faith community and call it the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ. He and a handful of followers initially worshipped at the chapel inside Rollins Mortuary, a black funeral home, and then the barber shop, until they completed construction of a new church building located about a mile away. When we met, he was still leading a congregation of more than 80. Reverend Linton told me Howard and Linton once housed a beauty shop in the back, and was one of the few barber shops in the South that catered to both sexes. There, in 1951, black clergy founded the Ministerial Alliance, which became a backbone of the local civil rights movement. In February 1956, Autherine Lucy, the first black student to enter the University of Alabama, sought refuge there from a white mob. Black men armed with shotguns and rifles surrounded the building, while a team of beauticians flushed egg and gravel from her hair and washed her clothes. 8 years later, as racial violence spiked in Tuscaloosa, Joe Malisham, son of Reverend Malisham, organized an armed black resistance group there that became known as the Defenders. Reverend Linton wanted me to learn all this and to meet others who were part of the movement. He introduced me to his family. Locals invited me into their homes and showed me scrapbooks. I soon realized there was no more important civil rights story to those who lived through the event known as Bloody Tuesday, even in a state that had witnessed the Montgomery bus boycott, the Birmingham campaign, and the Selma to Montgomery March. Reverend Linton had long planned to write his own book about Bloody Tuesday, but life's duties always seemed to call him away. Besides cutting hair 6 days a week and serving as a minister, he hosted a weekly worship service on local radio station Praise, 93.9 FM, 790 AM, WTSK, met regularly with city leaders seeking his blessing on their initiatives, and attended the bi-weekly meetings of the Ministerial Alliance. Instead of penning his memoirs, Reverend Linton kept the front half of his barber shop looking much like it did on Bloody Tuesday, as a living memorial of sorts. It was warmed by a cranky gas heater in the winter and cooled by a loud fan in the summer. A red and white Coke bottle dispenser sat snugly in a corner. 3 green leather chairs and their wash sinks lined one wall. Dozens of brass spittoons scattered the floor, leftovers from when chewing tobacco was commonplace. Reverend Linton still shaved men with straight-edged razors, then reached for his favorite grooming products like Jerris Hair Tonic, Vitalis, and Clubman Musk Aftershave, even as they became increasingly hard to find. He encased one of his poll tax receipts in a chunky gold-leaf frame and tacked it to the wall next to his personal barber chair. It showed that he paid $1.50 to vote in 1957, as prescribed by the 1901 Alabama Constitution. He taped a 2-foot by 3-foot copy of it to the large mirror facing the chair. Staring at the receipt was an unavoidable part of any haircut or shave. I asked him once why he had put it there. He said, "I don't want anyone to forget what it was like." Reverend Linton crammed his shelves with hundreds of colorful shaving mugs bought at yard sales and given to him as gifts, the oldest dating to 1892. He hung pots of devil's ivy, the bright green and white leafed houseplant, from the ceiling, and allowed its 15-foot shoots to festoon the walls. Customers waited in wooden chairs with purple cushions, pushed against a side wall. Above one chair was a poster commemorating Bloody Tuesday, designed by his brother Henry, a landscape watercolorist. Above another was an outdated calendar printed by Rollins Mortuary. Nearby was a small coffee table covered with recent editions of Jet, Ebony, the Tuscaloosa News, and a handful of children's magazines. Part of Reverend Linton's interest in this book was the timing of its inception. Only recently could he even recall Bloody Tuesday. Up until 2 years ago, I suppressed all of that, tried to get it out of my mind. I didn't even want to think about it, wanted to forget it. 46 years later, the pain had diminished to the point where his mind allowed him to remember it. I was lucky to have met him when I did. Others told similar stories. Maxie Thomas has one of the most dramatic. The police caved in the right side of his face on the steps of First African Baptist, nearly killing him. He remembered nothing about it for decades. To me, it was so painful. You don't want to do it. Have you ever had a closet that, you don't want to get rid of things, but you just throw it over there in that closet? That's what happened to my thought process about that. I had it back there, and I never thought about it because I had built that wall. Slowly, Thomas grew more confident in his ability to recollect, until one day he could answer a question from his granddaughter, who had found a picture of him injured on Bloody Tuesday in the bottom drawer of his bedroom dresser. And she said, "Who is this?" And I said, "That's me." "Why you got that patch on your head?" Then I took that as an opportunity to educate, so I went through that whole thing. However, Thomas still sees Bloody Tuesday through a heavy fog. That was a day that I sometimes think some things happened that I've asked people about, because I'm thinking it may be a dream. I learned to trust that memories like his, violent, confusing, swirling with questions, would guide me to write the story the way it needed to be told. In the spring of 2013, almost 4 years after we met, Reverend Linton gave me a tour of the small rooms at the rear of his barber shop that were curtained off from public view. It was his private museum, and where Autherine Lucy had been cared for a generation before. Framed photos and newspaper articles commemorating civil rights victories jammed the walls. One of his favorites was among the most recent, a copy of the front page of the Tuscaloosa News, announcing the election of Senator Barack Obama as president on November 4, 2008. Nailed to one wall were the colored and white signs that were once ubiquitous across the South. Reverend Linton left me on my own at one point. I walked around the rooms slowly. I saw a large black rectangle on one wall, and later asked him what was missing. He said 2 white women, whom he had allowed to look around by themselves, had stolen a picture of blacks marching down Greensboro Avenue and another of Reverend Rogers being arrested. Only recently had he allowed visitors back into this area. I think that my being white, like the thieves, partly explains why it took so long before Reverend Linton pulled back the curtain and allowed me to wander by myself through his museum. He needed to make sure I was respectful of his story. I learned much later that many people interested in his life and the civil rights movement visited him only once or twice. He hoped for more than a single appointment from those who would tell his history. Looking back, I realized that part of earning Reverend Linton's trust meant appreciating his vision of history. From our earliest conversations about Bloody Tuesday, Reverend Linton repeatedly said that I needed to tell it. Initially, I understood that I should write the story as I was trained to do, gather new evidence, determine a theoretical perspective, and show its value to the overall literature on the civil rights movement. Reverend Linton agreed that these steps were necessary, but he also wanted me to center his experience of violence and loss at the book's core, and more importantly, not let it languish there. He believed that what he and his contemporaries had experienced could help people think differently about the city's history, and maybe even live differently, more honestly and humbly. Yet its impact would be limited if it was restricted solely to the pages of a book. His story needed to get into the schools and churches. We needed to put up signs witnessing to what happened. Tell it. I told him that I needed to publish before doing anything else. Reverend Linton said he cared about when this book came out, but more than publication was at stake. Then he asked me, "What if no one reads it?" Reverend Linton, Maxie Thomas, and hundreds of others who lived through Bloody Tuesday understood something about the study of Southern history that I am still learning. Listening to their accounts of racial violence and struggles for justice could expand how I understood the practice of history, if I let it. Perhaps it was Reverend Linton's theological training that led him to believe that studying unwarranted suffering could lead to new ways of appreciating the past and living in the present. One afternoon over lunch, he put the challenge simply: the memory you choose, that's who you are. The stories we tell, or don't tell, shape how we live. I understood better what Reverend Linton was trying to teach me when we started to work together. This was around the time he showed me his museum. We collaborated on a civil rights trail guide, created from dozens of stories submitted by locals, which led to the installation of commemorative markers across the city. When Reverend Linton saw one go up in front of his shop, he said it was one of the happiest days of his life. He also asked me, only half-jokingly, why did it take so long? Because of our conversations, I based my teaching about religion and the civil rights movement in the story of Tuscaloosa, and with my students, interviewed Reverend Linton's friends and colleagues. We learned about local lynchings, and students worked with me to design a course on the history of lynching in the state. They built a website to host their research and inspire others to investigate lynching in their own hometowns. For a year, I taught a daily class at Tuscaloosa's Central High School about researching local black history that Reverend Linton and other black pastors helped create. Central's students, who are nearly all black, investigated the lives of locally enslaved people, constructed a digital memorial to lynching victims in Tuscaloosa County, and hosted a seminar on mass incarceration in Alabama. The class was the first of its kind in the state, and several graduates enrolled at the University of Alabama to do more of this work with me. It expanded to other high schools, led to a summer program on social justice for middle schoolers, and became the basis of a district-wide curriculum on Alabama and civil rights history. Telling this history led me on winding paths through churches, old jails, meat and threes, funeral homes, and graveyards across the Deep South. I learned, sadly, that Bloody Tuesday never really ended. For decades, stories were trapped behind doors of memory, locked tight by the pain of that day and the shame of living in a city that allowed it to happen. Most survivors have only recently shared their experiences and are angry because no one was ever brought to justice for hurting them. No book fully captured their history, and no school taught their truth. Whites who were part of that day carried different scars. A rookie police officer cannot fully block the sight of his peers clubbing a pair of black demonstrators. A reporter still hears the sound of black bodies thudding to the ground. Other communities in the South have stories like Bloody Tuesday, not always as violent, but just as important to their histories. The chapters that follow are my attempt to fulfill Reverend Linton's challenge. Introduction. It was like slavery in another era. Tuscaloosa, 1964. No black person walked alone on Greensboro Avenue in Tuscaloosa in 1964. This broad, handsome street runs southward from the Black Warrior River for nearly a mile and a half. It was crowded with antebellum mansions, churches with tall steeples and all-white memberships, City Hall, the new county courthouse, and upwards of 100 stores and restaurants. It traveled through the heart of the city and demarcated its color line. Blacks lived to the west of it, whites to the east. Greensboro Avenue was not an absolute division, to be sure. Many blacks employed at the University of Alabama lived in the adjacent Daly Bottom neighborhood, while black businesses clustered on a 2-block strip on 21st Avenue, dubbed the Blue Front, both east of Greensboro Avenue. But black Tuscaloosans knew what this roadway symbolized. Troy Bishop, a native son, felt his world shift when he crossed it, and the railroad line near it. Life was okay until you left the neighborhood, and then, once you left the neighborhood, it was another world. Across the track, that was the difference between going to heaven and hell. This side of the track was heaven for us. It was hell on the other side because, well, you know why. White people were over there. Every brick and curbstone that made up Greensboro Avenue held memories of racial violence. Between 1868 and 1933, at least 9 lynchings and 4 attempted lynchings of black men occurred on or near it, making it among the bloodiest strips of roadway in the state. Some killings were public events. On Monday, July 18, 1884, a citywide search snatched up 19-year-old Andy Burke, rumored to have sexually assaulted a white girl, and locked him up in the city jail. Close to midnight, a white mob broke him out. They scalped him, disemboweled him, shot him 5 times, and hanged him from an oak tree at 9th Street in Greensboro. The corpse was left in the open for 24 hours. Stories of executions like this one were whispered across generations in the city, the 4th largest in the state, where blacks numbered nearly 19,000, or 30% of its population. Troy Bishop heard them from his mother, who never let him leave their house after dark. Of course, she was always vigilant because you've got to understand, older blacks knew about the hangings. They knew about the shootings. They knew about the people that were drowned and never seen again. While in elementary school, Alfred Jones's ears buzzed with warnings about never being alone with white people or the police. Because it was, as I learned to realize, it was a matter of life and death. Because there were people that were found hung on all kinds of things, people my age, and you could get kidnapped, and the police will kill you, and everybody you know. You learn it. They teach it to you for your self-survival. Jones's early education included lessons about a crime rarely documented, but much discussed behind closed doors. I've heard a lot of stories that police would go and get black women and rape them and then throw them out of the car there. You know, just somewhere on the street walk, whatever. And I've heard many stories where they would kick them out of the car, and you didn't want to get arrested for nothing. Valerie Hawkins learned about these horrors from her grandmother, Big Mama, who put it simply, "You know why the Black Warrior River is called black? Because there are so many black people at the bottom of it." Oscar Watts described modern black life in Tuscaloosa bluntly. It was like slavery, in a different era. One of the most violent chapters of the civil rights movement that stretched across the nation took place on Greensboro Avenue during the spring and summer of 1964. Blacks and whites clashed over the meaning of freedom that year, but the story is largely untold. Only a short drive from Birmingham and Selma, Tuscaloosa is not usually mentioned alongside those cities' famous civil rights histories, yet it belongs with them as an important battleground in the escalating conflict between black activists and white segregationists in the South during the 1960s. Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. formally declared the start of the Tuscaloosa campaign on March 8, 1964, at First African Baptist Church, 2 blocks west of Greensboro Avenue. Until this point, local efforts to overturn segregation had been limited and unsuccessful. He made the announcement while preaching the installation sermon for the church's new pastor, Reverend T.Y. Rogers, his 29-year-old protege and former student, who he had appointed as his assistant pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery in 1956. Reverend King told the overflow crowd that Reverend Rogers would lead them with the full backing of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, which he had founded in 1955 and currently presided over. After the service concluded, he informed reporters, for the first time publicly, that his summer plan to redouble attacks on Jim Crow in Alabama included Tuscaloosa as a key target. Reverend King recognized the value that breaking the color line in Tuscaloosa could have on the larger civil rights movement. On the afternoon of June 11, 1963, Vivian Malone and James Hood had integrated the University of Alabama after President John F. Kennedy federalized the Alabama National Guard and forced Governor George Wallace to accept them. The story of the peaceful desegregation of the last all-white Southern university had kept Americans glued to their television sets and radios all day. That evening, President Kennedy finally announced his support for a civil rights bill on national television. Yet 9 months later, black Tuscaloosans were still chasing freedom. The federal government was no longer playing a direct role in the local struggle for desegregation, and the National Civil Rights Bill had not yet been signed into law, though it was inching closer. Tuscaloosa was also the home of Robert Shelton, the Imperial Wizard of the United Klans of America, by far the largest and most powerful branch of the Ku Klux Klan. The 35-year-old was one of the most prominent defenders of segregation in the country, and worked from an office on the 4th floor of the Alston Building on Greensboro Avenue. He counted Governor Wallace, another arch segregationist, though one without his appetite for violence, as a friend, and helped him win the gubernatorial election in 1962. Shelton smiled approvingly when Governor Wallace, during his inaugural address from the steps of the state capitol, delivered his famous promise, "In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever." It was a line penned by Asa Carter, the governor's speechwriter, a local Klansman, and friend of Shelton's. Shelton's Klan leadership marked the latest chapter in Tuscaloosa's long history of racism. Established in 1819, the city had been the state capital from 1826 to 1846, and a hub of cotton production during the antebellum era. Enslaved people, 10,145 of them, formed almost half of Tuscaloosa County's population on the eve of the Civil War. During the war, the University of Alabama, founded in 1831, became known as the West Point of the South, because so many of its graduates became Confederate officers, and its second president, Basil Manley, was named chaplain of the Confederacy.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?